Welcome back to another episode of Tank Talks. I'm your host, Matt Cohen, and on this week's episode, we welcome the OG of Canadian Venture Capital, Matt Roberts, to discuss the launch of his new VC fund, GaN Capital. Matt and I go back to the beginning of his journey growing up in the Roberts household, where he witnessed firsthand the creation of one of Canada's greatest tech visionaries and entrepreneurs, his father, John Roberts, and how that influenced his upbringing. Next, we dig into his time working for legendary tech investor Terry Matthews and the lessons he learned from Terry as an angel investor, and how Matt ended up leading the corporate development group at GaN Systems and helped raise their first few rounds of funding. Next, we jump into Matt's role at BDC IT Fund and ScaleUp Ventures, and some of the lessons he learned leading some amazing investments during his time at those two firms, and how Matt has seen the Canadian venture capital landscape evolve over the last decade since he first started in the industry. Lastly, Matt shares why he decided to launch his newest VC fund, GaN Capital, with partner David Dufresne, and what he can expect from the duo over the next couple years. Now, let's jump into the tank for this week's episode with Matt Roberts from GaN Capital. Thanks for joining me in the tank today, Matt.
Thanks for having me, my friend.
This is going to be quite confusing with two Matts in the studio, but we'll give it our best shot. You know, some might say, Matt, that you are the OG of startups and venture investing in Canada. At least that's the way I think about you. But before we dig into all that fun stuff, can you tell us a bit about your childhood growing up in one of the, most pioneering technology families of Canada and how that shaped your life in startups and technology moving forward?
My father is, or was, he's passed away a few years ago now, a founder of a semiconductor company that at the time was quite well known. It was called Calmos or Tundra. And he was the early employee of Canada's perhaps first semiconductor company way back after he graduated from university. So he came to Canada to go work there. Many of his colleagues were the original founders of tech companies in Ottawa and in Canada. And so they were sort of like, the father figures out there. You have a barbecue in the backyard and you run into a guy like Terry Matthews or a guy named Mike Copeland. And as a child, you didn't really have a sense of who these people were. But as you sort of grew up, you sort of had a sense that they were building something important and interesting. And occasionally you'd see a newspaper article and a picture of the guy from the backyard barbecue. And you'd be, oh, that's interesting. And so working with my dad, I think you look up to your parents, right? I'm sure you do too. And then you get a sort of sense of, is what they're doing interesting to me? And for me, it was. So I sort of just tried to follow in those footsteps, and eventually it led me to where I am today.
And that was, what age would you say, like you started really looking up to what they were doing as really cool stuff?
I don't know, 10 or 12. Sort of before that, it was kind of like a little bit too far. Like I knew my dad was a founder and started his own company because occasionally our summer vacations got canceled when it wasn't a good year at the business. But Disney World, no Disney World this year, sort of thing, right? I was like 10 or 12. I got my own computer, and it sort of led me down to wait a minute, my dad makes computer chips. There's chips in this computer, and you started to sort of get a sense of how cool this could be, and then you started looking around at what else was going on, and I think it was about 13 when I got my first sort of summer job in tech, if you will, beyond just sort of, mowing lawns and clearing sidewalks in the winter.
You're like, wait, my dad's building the guts of this machine that I'm playing around with and playing games.
Yeah. And so like I said, hey, he'd sort of done like, science projects with me around electronics and stuff. But like the cool stuff was, he knew a guy named Doug Smeaton who'd worked with him at one point and did reverse engineering of chips. He thought that'd be a good way for me to learn how they work was kind of look inside them, and they're tiny, but there was this company that would reverse engineer them. And so what they do is they take a camera with on a microscope and take pictures of the chips, and they blow up the photograph to sort of a foot by a foot, and put and in sections across a floor. So you'd have like 40 of these across a floor, and then you trace paper out the lines of the chips to figure out how they worked. And then you take that trace paper and put it into a CAD machine, and then after 3 or 4 weeks of work, you'd have a semiconductor like chart, and you'd figured out how the other guy had built a chip. And so you'd have all these great engineers standing behind me, sort of saying, "Well, this is what this is doing. This is what this is doing." So you sort of slowly, by osmosis and a mentorship from those guys, learned how a chip is designed and how it works.
Right. A pretty amazing group of people to grow up around. But, besides the success your father had, obviously, in building and creating the semiconductor industry in Canada, he also, grew up poor and had, a lot of luck along the way that he talks about. And you talked about, in the writings that you've written about him. Like, how did that shape who you are today?
It sort of gives me a sense of like anybody can do this with the right mentorship and the right opportunities. And, our job is not to be gatekeepers, but to make sure that, we're enabling talent and people who know what they're doing to do what they're doing. My dad would never have gone to university if it hadn't been for the fact that sort of the head of his sort of manufacturing line, my dad was an electrician's assistant, and he the head of at the Hoover vacuum cleaner company in South Wales. And they'd had a strike, and they'd raised money from Hoover vacuum cleaners to send their bright young team members to university. And it was his boss who sort of identified him and said, "I'm going to send you to university after this." So if it hadn't been for that, my dad would never have become an engineer, never have gone to university, never come to Canada. So we buy Hoover vacuum cleaners in this house.
You buy Hoover vacuum cleaners. It makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, it's not the same company really anymore, but there's a little bit of, just to remind myself of where it all started.
That's a good thing to do. But you also got to work with, one of the most successful entrepreneurs, one of the, I believe, Welsh's first billionaires, Terry Matthews, as an analyst. What was that like?
So Terry, for those who don't know, is Canada's most successful tech entrepreneur. There's a lot of people who claim a title that's close by, but Terry's started more companies and made more money than when I was growing up. The company at the time was a company called Newbridge Networks, which was his second major company. And it was, I guess, the Shopify of the 90s. It was like, there was Nortel, there was sort of the old stodgy Nortel and attached to Bell. And then you had Newbridge Networks, which was run by entrepreneurs. It wasn't part of Bell, coming up out of nowhere and taking over the world slowly. And it had 2,000 or 3,000 people working for it at the time. Mostly at that point on software, like we're doing software testing. Another way of sort of learning how things work is to watch where things fail. So software testing was a good early start in the software development space for me. Newbridge became this huge thing. It was like valued about $6 to $8 billion. It was a huge company at the time, headquartered in the west end of Ottawa, right near my house. So working for Terry was kind of like working for Canada's tech industry in one person, right?
You just walk to work every day and know that you're working underneath like one of the most successful entrepreneurs at all time.
I walked to work, and then and one day Terry saw me waiting for the bus because it was cold and I didn't want to walk anymore. So he picked me up in his car and drove me into work. And then I thought maybe from now on I should just stand at that bus stop. And it turns out Terry doesn't drive down by that bus stop all that much. But eventually I became like the youngest manager at Newbridge at about 16, 17 years old. 17, living with your parents and earning at the time like a significant like manager's wage, which was like, I don't know, $42,000, $43,000.
Yeah. I guess you were managing people older than you too?
I was a project coordinator. So I didn't have any direct reports. I had lots of people reported to me based on the project I was managing. So I'd manage a project. So I guess I was ostensibly their boss in the context of that project, but they all really worked for other people and were just working on the segments of this project that I had.
Well, working around you and working through you, I guess, is the way to put
Absolutely.
it. That's still pretty impressive at 17 years old. You also were the second full-time employee at GaN Systems, a company your dad helped start, which was also recently acquired by Infineon for $830 million. I mean, can you share a bit of the insight on how you helped that company raise its first few rounds of capital during your time as head of corp dev, and how you shaped your views on venture capital?
I'd gotten to work for Terry's family office after I graduated from school. So I kind of felt I knew the tech venture market in Canada through Terry. But Ottawa went through a huge convulsion. Ontario and venture capital went through a huge convulsion, sort of in the late aughts. Most people don't talk about it. There's like Ottawa in the late 90s was like the number one tech ecosystem in Canada, bar none. Something like 45% of all tech deals were done in Ottawa. That's obviously not the case today. The sort of the final nail in the coffin, if you will, was when Nortel went bankrupt. All of the Nortel engineers had been sort of angel investors and had done quite well. And they had pension plans. So while they would invest out of their RSPs or the cash they'd made elsewhere, they always knew they had this pension in the background to sort of keep them going. So they used that as play money and had the pension in the background, right? But then like Nortel goes bankrupt and the pension becomes a big question mark. And so suddenly those sort of like side fund money that they were playing with is now actually material money and might be all they can live on, right? And so the angel market just fell apart in Ottawa. So you couldn't raise any seed money for anybody. Back in those days, that's when Shopify was raising. And they raised their money from restaurateurs and like, local dentists. And the same thing happened sort of with GaN. We sort of lost the network of people who understood what semiconductors we were building. And we had to start rallying money from sort of real estate investment firms and things like that, the people who were really out of the context of it.
It's hard to find those people too, I bet.
It was, and certainly in 08, 09, it was really tough for obvious reasons. The financial crisis was in full swing, and I don't think people remember that on Wikipedia it says it took 12 months. In my recollection, it was like a 3-year digging out of a big problem. So we had that problem, and then we also had the issue that the VCs were kind of just scarce, sort of in 2009 to 2010 to 2011. We Chrysalix Capital out of Vancouver, and they're still around today, was well known for backing early stage sort of tech companies in the sort of quasi clean tech space. And we raised money from them, and we raised money from Rockport Capital. But it took, from the first meeting we had with Chrysalix, I think my first meeting with them was in February 2010. We closed the series, like the seed, Series A, whatever you want to call it. It was a seed. It'd be a seed round today. It was the Series A then. We raised that money and closed it in October of 2011. So over 17 months to get that one done.
And what was the round size and valuation, just for sense of?
So it was 5 million, 5 million US. I think it was on a 8 or 9 pre. There was it was tranched on milestones based on whether or not the chips that came back from the fab worked. So had the first batch of chips not worked, we would have
milestone based funding. Those are good ones.
Hey, they're back, baby. And and so it was a sort of like they had an option for another 3 at the same pricing if they wanted, if we could find a good use for it, which they took. It was like they took a good chunk of the company at the front end.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously it worked out, and it helped you get your first real institutional venture gig working at BDC.
Yeah, well, sort of. When I'd worked for Terry as an analyst before that, I'd been on an observer on a board with a guy named Ron Warburton, who's still at the BDC today. Ron's leading their seed practice over there now. So Ron, when I was going to go do my MBA, I went to Ron and said, "Hey, should I do an MBA?" And he sort of nodded his head and said, "Yeah, in this market, everybody should just go away for a year, come back." And so he saw me. I'd introduced him to Shopify in 2007. That was kind of like my famous thing in the venture community in Canada way back when, 15 years ago. As I was the young analyst at Terry's family office, introducing every VC in Canada to Shopify. Sort of a year or two before they did their Series A. Nobody invested. Nobody took it too seriously, unfortunately for me. But Ron sort of remembered that and said, "Hey, why don't you come work with me at BDC? We'll find something for you here." And so the day after, literally the day after the GaN Systems deal closed, I joined BDC.
Wow. Wait, so did Terry's family office invest in Shopify when you were there?
Nope. So Terry came to me, and that was the complaint. I took the deal to Terry. They were doing an angel round. This was 2008, early 2008. And I went to Terry and I said, "Hey, there's these guys doing this e-commerce company. You should take a look at it." And so he looked at the pitch. I don't think he met Toby at that time. And he said, "Matt, I got a lot of things going on right now. I don't need another one.
The world is blowing up." Yeah.
Yeah. It was like everything was on fire. Or the real estate market was on fire. And Wesley Clover, the firm I worked for, had a lot of like real estate holdings as well. So kind of like, let's just pause any new investments at that time.
Prudent thing to do, of course, but
yeah, prudent, but in hindsight. And then at the same time, I said, "Well, can I introduce it to our friends, the other VCs?" He said, "Yeah, absolutely, go call them." So I called most of the major VCs in Canada at the time and a few US ones, and nobody was really interested at the time.
Yeah, fair enough. But you joined Ron at BDC IT Fund in 2011 to help lead their IT fund and made some pretty exciting investments during those years. How did your time at BDC help your thought process on being an institutional investor and leading rounds?
So from family office to institution is a pretty big change. Family office is great because you know exactly who the decision maker is. It's the person who is in the family. And then institutions, it is a lot of sort of convincing your fellow colleagues through arm twisting and information and work. So it brought rigor to an investment process, really. And the BDC is good at rigor. I'm sure anybody who's listening would accept that statement. Ron is probably one of the more underrated investors in Canada, in my opinion. So are a number of the colleagues I had while I was there. There are some phenomenal investors in the BDC general partner pool that just do excellent deals and do excellent returns. Harder to see with such a broad swath of people over there. like doing lots of economic development on at the same time as they're doing direct investments for capital return for the sake. So Ron, Steve Abrams, Andrew Lugston, Robert Simon, that IT venture team that I worked with, I was the first non-partner hire they brought in. And so it was a lot of and they'd been doing it for about 8 years at that point. So it was a lot of learnings for me to do it. And they did it through some of the worst times, right? They all started in sort of 2001, 2002.
Right. And you got to write checks in a good time of 2011, 12, 13, just when
we were blessed with capital, and the sort of the envelope to go forth and spend, and find. And so we got great deals in that portfolio, I think. And
you saw some good exits too.
We had some great exits then, and we have some great logos today. That's the 2012. It's a 2012 vintage, 2011, 2012 vintage fund. Has done phenomenally well. The 2015 or 14 fund that we did afterwards, I think, is probably going to be one of that vintage is probably one of the best vintages in Canada right now.
Yeah, fantastic. What are some of the biggest ones carrying a lot of the weight?
We have Sonder in there. We have Hopper in there, so that's good. We have some good exits. We were in Wave Accounting as well. There's a ton of great companies. Aavik out of Waterloo was one of the big exits for that. That's sort of a secondary to a private equity firm.
Well, you obviously carried that momentum forward, when you joined Kevin Kimsa and Kent Thexton at ScaleUp in 2016.
Kent and Kevin were both at Omers with John. They were former coworkers of his. And so it was an interesting time. The fund was created by the previous Ontario Liberal government working with Nadir Mohammed. So Nadir Mohammed was the first non-Rogers family member to be the CEO of Rogers. Nadir sort of took over after Ted passed away, and sort of after his tenure as CEO, sort of wanted to give back to Canada. Nadir was an immigrant to Canada, sort of running the what was Ryerson's University's sort of board at that time, and wanted to see how he could be more involved in sort of helping entrepreneurs who were coming to Canada and who were already here. So he convinced Kathleen Wynne to back a fund that would also have corporate backing. So with his help, myself, Kent, Kevin, raised money from kind of the who's who of corporate Canada. So we have in Fund 1 of ScaleUp, we have RBC, TD, Bank of Nova Scotia, Rogers, Bell, Antelis, the Weston families, an investor, Magna's an investor, Ryerson.
It really was the who's who for a first-time fund, for sure.
Absolutely. It was, phenomenal LP list. We have, and we have the regular sort of fund-to-fund teams. We have BDC in there as well. Kensington's in there through their BC Tech Fund, a few others as well. So you find that we really punched above our weight on our first time fund, closing at 106. All people with experience in the business, but certainly with Nadir's help, it was much easier to get it done.
Absolutely. And what was it like going from an associate to a partner? And how did you change your risk taking approach as a fund investor with private LP capital instead of government capital at BDC?
I don't think I changed. It doesn't feel like I think when you're changing yourself, you don't notice it as much. It's like when you're exercising, you don't know the day-to-day incremental gains you're getting.
I don't know. I don't exercise.
Oh, well, you look good for the non-exercising. I think what we had to think about there more carefully was our ability to manage the cycle of the fund. So the concentration risk was more paramount to us. The ability to maintain follow-on capital was stronger. At the BDC, we did those things as well. But if we were over our skis or maybe needing some capital, there was no concern about our being able to do capital calls because it's a bank and it's the government's bank. There's always capital in the bank account. Whereas with us, there is a sort of an understanding of how we pull down the capital to invest and how close to our total concentration risk we can do and how we think about follow-on capital from both taking advantage of good, one of our winners, but also making sure we have capital to play with should something sort of, not work out and we need to sort of put capital at play to protect an investment or to double down on some of those bigger winners or just play with the big boys if they try and put structure around our next deal.
Right. I mean, that's definitely a lot of what I would say is the biggest change when taking on private LP capital and running institutional fund. It's portfolio construction, it's reserve strategy, it's, how to know what to hold back, but how to know when to press your bets. It's very finite, the resources you have to deploy. So you got to think very hard. And then also dealing with your partners on what they want to do and coming to an agreement with them.
With your partners, you all have to decide how you want to prioritize which deal and why. So it can be very rewarding in order to sort of have that sort of pushback from your colleagues. It can also be a real frustrating moment if you're not good at articulating why you think we should be doing this, right? So it forces you to raise your game on transparency and pushing data and information to your colleagues in a way that they can sort of understand it quickly, because they're never going to be as deep into your deals as you might be yourself, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's why we tell our founders when they're pitching, a principal or a junior partner, they need to empower that partner to sell that internally as best they can, because they are your external sales team.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think most entrepreneurs have a tendency to be dismissive of the more junior staff they want to talk to the general partner because that's the decision maker. They don't seem to understand just how clearly and how powerful, an associate with a deep interest in your company can get something over the line.
Right, because they'll give you the time and they'll collect all the data and put it together perfectly for the pitch for the general partner, where a general partner may not.
Yeah, as an analyst, as an associate, you want those people to be your promoters, because they're constantly going to be thinking about your deal, because they're wanting to build their career. The associates can't say yes, but they can make it a no. And so it's incumbent on you to make sure that those people are as excited about your deal as everybody else.
Yeah. I mean, I think our favorite thing is to see our analysts who graduate from the Ripple X program become analysts at another venture fund. Obviously, we were close with them at their very beginning of their career. Then they go to associate and then principal. And then all of a sudden, they're like the gatekeepers for us now who are close with us to share our deals with those other funds. And that's like just watching the ripple effect happening there is really cool to see from people who gave a chance on when they had no access to venture capital. But speaking of the changes in venture capital, you've been around for a while. You've seen the ups and downs, obviously, hopefully more ups than downs. How has the Canadian venture capital industry evolved from your days at BDC and then ScaleUp to see some of the best and the worst things about the industry, in your opinion?
It's been an interesting ride. If you take from my very early days of investing, Canada's been a sort of a smiley face of a curve to some extent. More recent years being a little bit higher than the previous years, but what people forget was, in some form or another, Canada was doing 3 or 4, maybe even $5 billion worth of venture capital in the year 2000, and by 2008, when I was raising the funding for GaN Systems, we hit a low of sort of under 800 million, and it's been up, quasi up. It was flat. It was flat for a few years after that, but it was quasi up since then, year to year, and then very dramatically in the past 3. So there's been lots of good things. There was an emphasis on early stage company creation in the early part of sort of 2010 to 2015, and you saw that borne out by the sheer number of companies that were started and raised capital in Canada. You're seeing that that emphasis tail off by the sort of the government players and where it is today, and in the LP focus in Canada as well. So you don't see as much company creation right now. And we are also seeing a number of our colleagues who were, probably more focused on seed in the past, grow their funds to a point where seed is less as the emphasis internally for them. So there's now less seed lead institutional players than there were 5-6 years ago in Canada, which is surprising because we have had an explosion of what I would call seed investors who are not necessarily lead checks or institutionalized. Angel lists, syndicates, small family offices from exited founders or their staffs, but you don't see strong, institutionally based seed investors right now.
Well, it sounds like that's where the opportunity that obviously we saw at Ripple a couple of years ago is the same opportunity you're seeing now, because you decided to obviously launch.
Yeah, and I think I've seen it more now than I was even a few years ago when you guys got started. I think what you and I have seen is a lot of funds that were sitting on that fence between seed, late seed, and A, just have firmly entrenched themselves in the A rounds and are letting the seed rounds come to them as they've graduated up to their A rounds. You'll still hear about them doing it, so they're not exited the space, but it is not a major part of their business, and it is probably a check mark, like in a feature set rather than a focus. Like they have that feature, but it's not really what they do.
Why do you think that is, Matt? I think I know why that is, and I would love to hear your thoughts first.
There's a few possible reasons that you could say, and I probably agree with all of them. Like, one, seed is harder. It requires more time. There's a lot less data points to go with, so it's a lot more of emphasis on what you value as an investor you think you can bring, and what you think the founders are capable of doing. So there's a bit of sort of betting on the horse and the jockey, but less on the horse. There's also the fact that as these funds get larger, it's harder for your experienced GPs and partners to continue to do volume plays. Like, so I think most VCs would admit after about 8 to 10 deals, their capacity to find new deals of high quality and still bring rigor to their boards declines. And so there's less capability of them to do lots of C deals and lots of Series A deals at the same time in one fund. And if you have multiple funds, which many of our colleagues do as they graduate, you have 3 funds, you have, let's say, 25 to 35 deals in each fund, and you have 4 or 5 partners. It's a lot of work. Many graduate away from you, but some don't. You're still sitting on those boards. So, yeah, I think there's a number of sort of reasons why these things happen, and there's also the LP focus. They've gotten more comfortable in Canada, in particularly with doing investments into venture, but their teams haven't grown any larger either. So they're also trying to deploy significantly more amounts of capital, and they would rather do it into existing GPs that they have relationships with. And so that means those funds get bigger, and those funds need to do bigger deals. So they sort of gravitate away from the seed stage.
Yeah, you've answered it perfectly. It's the AUM game, right? As your AUM gets bigger, your fund size gets bigger. You just can't waste time on, $500K or $1 million seed checks.
Yeah. And if you are a larger fund, if I was running $1 billion fund, I'd still probably have a seed strategy as part of it, but more from a Texas Hold'em kind of like emphasis, where I do like lots of hands of poker, and see which hands are graduating. And I wouldn't and if the hand doesn't look good, I just wouldn't show up for the next round, right? I'd fold and walk away from the table.
It's interesting though, Matt, the problem with that strategy, which I'm sure you agree with, is, what we think is that the companies that take that capital, they don't actually get a lot of value out of those $1 billion funds early on. So you need firms like us to help them.
No, but I agree. I totally agree. I'm talking about if I was running the $1 billion fund. If I'm running my Command Capital, which is what we're trying to do, I don't think that's a healthy place for the founder to go to get what they want. Every founder thinks they're the outlier, so that they think that they will be that 1 in 10 that large $1 billion fund cares about in the next round, but they very often are not. Honestly, they're looking at the metrics; they're not looking at you. Whereas the people like you and I, who are in the trenches earlier on, are looking at the people as well as the metrics. And it sort of bleeds into 2 or 3 different ways of sort of figuring out whether or not we're on the cusp of something versus whether or not the numbers are showing us what we know to be true in the business. If you're running an Andreessen, this makes total sense. And people will take Andreessen's money because they want the logo. It gets them the TechCrunch article or the BetaKit article when they raise the round. Like it's a checkmark of legitimacy that's not necessarily true because somebody's playing a different game, and that's fine. But you and I both know that concentrated, focused investments at the earlier stage generally play better.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned it, so let's dive into it. You just recently announced the launch of Command Capital, spelled CMD, with former partner from Panache Ventures, David Dufresne, as a seed stage focus fund looking to invest in startups in Canada. So can you share us, why you chose to focus on AI at the seed stage in particular? You obviously explained why there's a gap, but maybe focus on the strategy and the thesis. And also why you decided to announce the fund announcement before holding a first close, I guess.
Yeah, so there's a couple of reasons. So I'll tackle the first part and I'll tackle the second part. We decided to announce it earlier on because both David and I are former guys at former places. There needed to be a sort of a line in the sand where the market was aware of the change. So I still sit on boards for some of my old portfolio companies, and it was clear that while we were talking to LPs and family offices, they would look at us and go, "Aren't you still at Panache? Are you still at ScaleUp, Matt?" So we needed to sort of articulate a line in the sand. Our due diligence program, the due diligence work that needs to be done on us, is happening in tandem, and we wanted to make sure that we were clearly delineated to those investment committees as they begin to dig in. That yes, we are doing this full time. Yes, this is our focus. Yes, this is what we're doing. It was just one of those things. We're very well known. Both Dave has been in the business as long as I have. I've known him for almost 20 years now. It's just that hey, we've had this long history at other places, which we I've just gone through. We needed to clear the air. The focus on AI is where David was at the BlackBerry Venture Partners Fund previously, and one of the things that we both noticed as we sort of go through this cycle of what when we started a year ago, we didn't think it was as much of a hype cycle, but it feels like it. Is that what we saw is something similar? The tools were becoming cheaper and easier to use by technically savvy developers who are not, focused entirely on the AI space. It was something similar to what we saw with mobile. Initially, 15 years ago, if you wanted to build a mobile app, you had to be much more in the weeds on how the development SDKs worked on each individual system. Today, you just download it from Apple or from Google, and you can develop a mobile app in about 15 minutes. We were watching the capability of all of the AI, technical APIs coming on board, and people beginning to play that with them inside of, generalist type, applications. So we were seeing this sort of opportunity where the wedge technology 15 years ago was using mobile to sort of go into enterprise, providing a mobile version of an enterprise product, using that as your wedge. So going mobile first, as you'll remember, using that as your wedge to get the customer, and then slowly creep up the feature set band. The AI space is going through something similar. It's where you start to see a lot of the AI components becoming available or commoditized, coming down into applications that wouldn't have necessarily been the first port of call for an AI solution, but people are taking advantage of what's available today and slowly building up those feature sets in the AI space for those individual sort of sectors of their customer base.
And would you say anything that touches AI, from consumer to, like you said, mobile applications to media, entertainment, travel, you don't have a specific focus on enterprise SaaS or insurance, health tech, or?
Well, I'd say we're B2B and more enterprise biased. And that's just because of the nature of where we are in the world. I haven't yet to see consumer products come out of Canada with major success. There are exceptions to that statement, but they're few and far between. So I don't think you'll see us in a, B2C or a consumer based, product line.
Given that you obviously are a seed stage focused investor, and maybe the lack of pre-seed and seed stage focused investors retreating from the market, especially in Canada, how do you think that's affecting the Canadian entrepreneur from building their startups today versus maybe a couple of years ago?
Let's be frank. There's two types of entrepreneurs out there. There's the sector specific, experienced, age 30, 35 plus, that they've done. They have good knowledge of their customer base, and they have a good knowledge of what the first customer is going to look like, and they build something for them. Those people are not stopping. They're continuing to do it, and they usually have some level of personal wealth, having worked somewhere for a number of years. That's not slowing down. I'm still seeing those founders. I'm seeing much less of the sort of start something straight out of school or 1 or 2 years out of like a Shopify or an Amazon, where they're like, I'm going to quit this job or quit the job at a Deloitte and go down the street and start a tech company and see how this goes. A number of factors are hitting that. One, they don't see easy access to accelerators or to $250,000 checks to help them. They're also dealing with student loans that are growing much more quickly under an interest rate that's much higher. So they're much less. They're a little bit more fearful about of jumping out the door with the debts that they have to pay off. Over the past 6-7 years, we haven't done a great job of giving them a sense of what kind of companies should get funded versus what kind of companies are. There was a lot of sort of hype cycle around, sort of crypto and even now in AI. And it looks like a hype cycle rather than, a strong investment thesis around, revenue generating products. I don't think they know what to build and for whom. And so you're seeing a lot of companies trying to do fake companies that look interesting but are not building anything of any real substance.
So is it fair to say you gravitate more towards the a bit more established, experienced founder building something they know needs to be built with a bit of wealth?
Well, not necessarily. No, I invested. I invested in a 21-year-old founder out of McGill, and we started Sonder together, right? So I'll do early stage, fresh founders, but I've just noticed that the ones who are building businesses that have a deep sort of focus on the customer are much tougher to work with right now because they're just not out there as much, right?
Yeah, I'd say like the funtrepreneurs are kind of done, who are in it for the touristy part of it. I'd say the ones who are really passionate about building something interesting, they may not know the customer to start with. But what they do know is that they could build it pretty quickly and pretty cheaply because of the tools available with AI right now and co-pilots and things like that, which is really exciting.
And those are the interesting ones, right? But it's interesting to see where they think it's going to go next. It's okay. You've got that customer, that first customer. You're using the API. This is not the hard part, guys. It's where do you take this product in order to defend it with a moat or defend it with, some sort of IP that or just the ability to get a solution in the customer hand at scale that will allow you to build a venture scale business. Those are where the question marks start to pop up.
So let's get into that then. How do you think that Command Capital can provide necessary support to startups beyond obviously the financial investing at the earliest stages during these tough market conditions?
Well, signaling to some extent, right? So right now, like let's back up and say there is a capital problem still, which we haven't alluded to, which is that lead check that you're solving and I'm trying to solve, right? You and I would probably notice that we meet numerous founders who have been told they're able to raise the money they want if they find that lead, and that lead is becoming less and less forthcoming in this particular market. So there is sort of a rigor that we're going to bring to our due diligence process and to our signaling out into the market. Our goal is to only lead our deals. Or co-lead, obviously, to work with our partners like yourself and others. But the others are count on one hand in this kind of country right now, and that's the problem we have. And then at the same time, identifying how to build a company from 6 people, 7 people to the 20 or 30 that it's going to necessarily have to be. That's where David and I have shined over the past 15 years of our careers, is building a level of growth into the company, getting revenues from sub 250K up to about $3 to $4 million through inside sales, through resellers, through enterprise sales, systems that we've done into the corporates that I've been working with while I was at ScaleUp as well.
Yeah, I mean, you've seen a lot. You've been a part of some pretty high-flying companies and had to go through some tough times with companies as well. You went through Sonder.
Yeah, it's tough out there right
exactly.
now.
Exactly. So what sort of advice would you give to somebody who's just starting out in the business, maybe as an associate or as a junior principal, who hasn't yet experienced a lot of those downs that you obviously had to face, especially during the pandemic with a lot of travel companies or a lot of marketplace companies?
Well, I got burned on a marketplace company, and we got beat up hard in the hospitality space. So the advice, if I can, is understand the macro more than I think people give it credit for. These were all the risks that popped up over the past 3 years for me were risks that were identified in the IM the day we did the first check. And they were the sort of Cassandra statements, if you will. Like, I worry about this world-ending event, the zombie apocalypse sort of event. Turns out there was a pandemic, so it was actually pretty smart. But we, for example, with Sonder, we called it the 2 risks: a huge economic downturn or another terrorist event, vis-a-vis like a September 11th. Those are the 2 major sort of systems that we could look at and say, okay, these could have huge ramifications for the business. So when we were building our leases for the properties that we used in that company, we had structure in them so that we could get out should one of those 2 types of events occur. We didn't expect both. So we had a 9/11 event, which was the initial sort of crash of fall off to zero travel for a number of months, and then you had the curve come back up, but you had essentially an economic hit on travel in the hospitality space that looked like the financial crisis. So we had both hit us at the same time. And actually, the company did quite well throughout, and it's done phenomenally well since in terms of its growth rate and its unit cost economics and its revenue growth as well. Where the next thing that hit us was the massive change in the multiples in the macro market that hit us once we did a SPAC on public.
These things all almost happen near the very end, I guess, of your time with the companies. Because you're investing at the pre-seed stage, it's good to be aware of these things and understand the macros, but they're so far out.
And probably, find your exits where you can, because we did have opportunities to find secondary opportunities, and ScaleUp is blessed with a very high DPI, in terms of where we are today. But at the same time, had we been more focused on the DPI perhaps a year ago, that DPI would be much higher today.
Would that be something you would take to your newest fund? Is that like knowing how to return capital, not just have good TVPI, is something to be focused on?
Yeah, I think it's incumbent in every seed fund. Seed funds, the ScaleUp was a seed Series A with a growth sort of bias, so it was a little bit of a different beast than what we're talking about at Command. At Command, I would be more focused on finding our secondaries, in the Series Bs and Cs than I would have been at ScaleUp, where we were sometimes coming in at the A and doing a Series B exit seemed a little bit like we were selling a little bit too early. Whereas, with Command, you're coming in the seed, you'll have an A round, a B round, you can start looking for those exits.
Well, that was $100 million fund at ScaleUp too, right? So
yeah, and this one will be, half that. It's easier to return those numbers, and you can do it more quickly, and you'll have a lot of early winners that look like winners because they're being signaled by outside valuations from third parties. I wouldn't put as much. My advice would be, and I know this, but my advice to a principal is I wouldn't put as much faith in those valuations until you can get liquidity from them.
100%. I mean, we've done the exact same thing in our first fund and returned half the fund because of those crazy valuations to allow us to do secondaries. So
same thing at ScaleUp. We have two or three deals that we know we want to ride out, and then we have a number of deals that we'll take some liquidity where we see those opportunities, as long as it doesn't impinge the management's ability to raise.
Absolutely. Speaking of looking ahead, what are some of the biggest trends or changes you foresee happening in the venture capital space in Canada, particularly, given the current challenging macro environment? And where do you think we'll come out maybe in the next 2 to 3 years?
Well, if you can tell the future in the next 2 or 3 years, come on. I don't know. High level, I'm watching our LP friends, seeing what they're able to raise for their particular funds. We're down market from them, but I think I see struggles, and I think the struggles are, I don't think we've seen the full accounting of what took place over the past 3 years hit all of the GPs that are in those portfolios today. So there's a number of funds out there who raised their fund with a 2020 or 2021 vintage, who did significant deployments in 2021 and 2022. The 18-month mark from those is coming up in Q3, Q4, Q1 next year. So you're going to see more write-downs, I think, coming in those. So I think you're going to find that the LPs are a little bit skittish about A, being able to raise, and B, where they want to deploy. And leaning back, it's not a crime to in their worlds to be slower. So I think we're going to see slower deployments from the LPs in the Q3 and Q4, which is not great for me because I'm fundraising from them right now.
Yeah, likewise. But hey, maybe it'll be like Terry Matthews missing the Shopify opportunity, and they have to think twice about that.
And I think some of them are. I think this vintage will be good because there is a sort of a lack of people on the ground doing great deals right now. I don't know where interest rates are going to land in the next 2 years, and that sort of defines any sort of answer for you. The second part of that question is, what do you think is going to happen 2 to 3 years from now?
I think it's that's why you always got to think about the macro, even if we're pre-seed investors.
Yeah, and if macro trends have an effect on the ability of people to quit their jobs to start businesses, that's not great. The old discussion used to be, I don't know if you recall, but when BlackBerry went bankrupt, everybody was like, "Oh, there's going to be thousands of little startups that come out of that," and there were a few, but not thousands, not lots.
No, because people had to pay their bills and pay their life insurance.
Many of them were not particularly entrepreneurial. They were in tech, but that does not mean you're entrepreneurial. We've seen thousands of layoffs from Shopify over the past how many months, quarters, and I can't say that I've seen tons and tons of Shopify ex-employees starting businesses. I am seeing them, but I'm not like them.
No, you know where they're going to work? They're going to work at the banks and Shoppers Drug Mart and the insurance companies because it's a safety net.
Absolutely. So, company creation doesn't come through layoffs is probably what we've all learned. And as more layoffs happen, people, focus in on stability rather than early stage. So that does not mean it's easier to hire. So I think companies that don't have cash in their banks or are not forthcoming about how they look financially are going to have, there's going to be a mix of difficulty finding those jobs. And people are going to hop to stability more than we think.
Absolutely. Well, we all wish them luck in raising their funds and hopefully allows us to get back to business. But before we wrap things up, Matt, we always ask our guests for their fast favorites. So first off, your favorite podcast.
I was listening to the history podcast. Hold on. I can't remember the guy's name right now, but I was on a flight yesterday and just lost in that.
Which are you like World War One?
The world. I'm doing I'm doing Supernova in the East or something like that. It's the Russian campaign.
Oh yeah, Dan Carlin.
Yeah, Dan Carlin. That's the guy's name. Thank you.
Fantastic. Favorite newsletter or blog?
Well, I'm enjoying Paul Wells. So I'm not sure if you know that. He's a political writer. He used to work for Maclean's. He started a new newsletter, and then there's also Mark McQueen, who I'm a big fan of. Okay,
let's just talk about that for a second. You wrote an incredible blog about why Mark should run for public office. How much did you talk to Mark ahead of time before you put that out?
I teased Mark with it a little bit. So I think when every time I heard that there was a riding that was looking for a leader, I'd send him real estate of those in that riding to go move to. So I'd find something on House Sigma and send him, hey, you could afford this house in Timbuktu, Ontario, and because Mark, you've had Mark on the program. I know I have a very high opinion of Mark. Mark's a successful entrepreneur. He's a successful man, but he is beyond reproach in my mind about how fair and reasonable he is, and how you can't. I wouldn't impinge his integrity at all.
Absolutely,
someone like that is somebody we want in Parliament. And I feel like somebody like that is never encouraged and doesn't see the upside to run for Parliament. It's incumbent on people like us who know people like this to encourage them to run, whichever political party they're sort of focused on. Just so happens that Mark and I share political ideologies, but I know people who I firmly believe would make they support the NDP. I don't, but I support them because I think they're just good people, and I want those good people to run. And I think for the tech community in particular, people like you and me, VCs and entrepreneurs, there's nobody that I can point to that clearly understands our business and what we're trying to do here in government today in any political party. There are people who are sympathetic to our needs, but they don't understand why it's really important.
No, absolutely. Mark I told him on the podcast, I don't wish it upon you to have the job, but I would love to see someone like you in the job.
Absolutely, and Mark's just a good guy, and he's available too. That's also kind of he's got a he's got a news he's got a
newsletter. Yeah, I'm trying to get him on the podcast more to speak, but he doesn't seem to want to spend too much time talking to me versus doing more tweets.
He's at a Pearl Jam concert or something.
Exactly.
Right?
Speaking of tweets, actually, you had a pretty famous tweet that happened a couple of weeks ago when you were talking about the commercial real estate crisis in San Francisco, and you had David Sachs reply and retweet, and then Elon Musk come at it. How did that feel for you?
So it happened the same day we announced the fund. So my phone kind of went from congratulations from people I knew to a bunch of weird messages from lots of random people. I ended up with lots more followers who I think are very disappointed by my Canadian content focus on my tweets, and they're slowly, I think, going to start unsubscribing as they start figuring it out.
Yeah, it was pretty cool though.
It was pretty cool. One of the main problems as we were talking about earlier with the interest rates and where they're going is I have a distinct feeling that there's something wrong in the commercial real estate market. I think we all know. If you and I walk downtown in Toronto, and if you were at 5 o'clock, if you stood at Adelaide and Bay, you would get bowled over by all the people leaving the businesses as they went to catch the train to get home out of the city. Today, it's empty. That is a huge concern for what those buildings where all those people used to work, are worth. And our pension plans, all Canadian pension plans, are invested in real estate. I'm very concerned, and I'm looking for signs of it. That's what I was writing about. That's what David Sachs found out about because he saw the tweet.
Well, it was a good tweet. You got 1.2 million impressions, so I'm sure that was a pretty big highlight. On top of it,
that's pretty good. That much,
exactly.
I didn't realize it was that many. Wow.
All right, moving on. Your favorite tech gadget?
Probably my phone. At this point, I'm impressed with the cameras on it. I have a baby boy who, less maybe more of a toddler now. I was about 14, 15 months old, and I'm just impressed by how it makes me look like I know what I'm doing with the pictures. Like I take these great pictures of him, and I'm not sure how it works because all the
maybe it's just he's a cute boy, and that's what makes it look good.
Oh yeah, no, he is. He looks like my wife, but but the backgrounds are all bokeh and stuff. It's very impressive. So
fantastic. Favorite new trend?
Probably the focus on revenue.
Oh,
I'm seeing from founders.
Nice.
I'm liking this trend. There was a long time when I felt like an old fart in these meetings, sort of talking about first customers, and now most of them volunteering who the first customers are going to be.
They come to the table ready to answer that question, which is good.
Yeah, maybe they know who I am and they've heard me talk about it before, but it's just great to see founders like really interested in selling things for a change.
Your reputation precedes you. Next is your favorite book.
0 to 1 is always a perennial seller. Every year I choose a book and I give it away. And so 0 to 1 was one of those, 5-6 years ago. I'm going through 7 Powers. I'm showing it here on the screen, but nobody else. Yeah, right there it is. And which is probably, it was one of the books I gave away back in 2016, 2017, I think, right when I was joining ScaleUp. I'm reading a guy named Tom Holland's book about Christianity of all things right now. It's very interesting to find out just how much of our world is, with this Christianity book, just how much, it's a history book, but how much of our world is, influenced by religion on things you and I would never think. I'm always surprised by weird, that we're doing this because it's religious. But I always thought it was just
right.
Right?
Death, taxes, What else?
Christmas trees.
Land, everything. Yeah, Christmas trees. Yeah, exactly.
I thought it was just some weird thing. Yeah.
Yeah. And last but not least, your favorite life lesson.
Honestly, to try something new every day, be it read something new, look at something new, try something. If you see an opportunity to do anything new, try it. Just do it.
Well, fantastic life lesson, and on to something new with your new fund at Command Capital. Thanks for joining us in the tank today, Matt.
Thanks, buddy. Take care.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Tank Talks. To learn more about this episode, be sure to go to Apple Podcast or Spotify to find more detailed notes on this episode or to check out previous episodes. Also, if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review and a rating as it helps us out a lot. And hit that subscribe button so you can get notified when new episodes come out. Finally, make sure to give me a follow on Twitter at Matty B. Cohen or at Tank Talk Podcast to stay up to date on new episodes or to be a guest on our show. Till next time,